I think if there's any one thing you can say about Kumba, it's that it was absolutely iconic. Premiering in 1993, when Disney had already established itself as the top attraction within the state of Florida, Busch Gardens knew how to distinguish its own experience through this absolute monster of a coaster, something that the state had never seen before. Of course, Busch Gardens was also distinctly different, having gone from bird gardens focused on promoting Anheuser-Busch beer products, to introducing the first thrill coasters to the state with Python in 1976 and Scorpion in 1980, both including inversions that were very intense for audiences at the time. Scorpion was a personal favorite of mine, as Busch Gardens Tampa was the park I grew up closest to, and because I did a retrospective on it in 2024 when it closed and was scrapped, I figured it makes sense to do it again now for Kumba. However, Kumba is something different, not just through its incredible scale, but also as an important part of history. When you think of the iconography of Florida, you might think of beaches, Gatorland, Disney World, and Miami, but the state has had many important attractions that have defined its development and history, and along with more quintessential images of Florida with places like Silver Springs or Cypress Gardens, I would argue that Kumba's interlocking corkscrews were once as mesmerizing as anything else, and its image was certainly used in Florida promotional material. Busch Gardens Tampa feels just as much an important part of Florida history as any Gilded Age hotel or the introduction of Universal Studios. And so, while I personally grew up appreciating and enjoying this coaster, I think part of what's sad about its recent closure is that it's a cultural icon. But you know what? For all the merit of Kumba, I think I might have a controversial take here. It's certainly a work of art, not just through its pacing and engineering, but also through how it plays with the landscape of the park as it roars through its layout. And yet, it was an earlier coaster from B&M before they really learned to refine their design. Its transitions weren't the best, its execution is sometimes clunky, and if you're comparing it to the other B&M loopers in Florida, the Incredible Hulk at Islands of Adventure and Kraken at SeaWorld, I think it's actually the worst ride experience of the three. That's not to say that it's bad, because it was certainly excellent, but you could feel how dated it was through the ride layout, and now at the end of its shelf life, would it really have been worth retracking to save instead of being replaced with something else? No, it was finally the appropriate time to go, hopefully to be replaced with something that respects its legacy, but moves in a new and interesting direction. Kumba truly is an important piece of history, both for the state of Florida and for the development of roller coasters. And so, let me tell you the story of why it's so interesting. Just a quick favor before we begin, but if you enjoy videos on this channel, the best way to support me is just to leave a like on the video. To understand why Kumba is so significant, you first need to start with the introduction of inversions on steel roller coasters. In 1975, Air Development premiered their first inverting coaster at Knott's Berry Farm as Corkscrew, named after its iconic and highly marketable double corkscrews. Just a year later, the first vertical loop was introduced by Schwarzkopf with Revolution at Magic Mountain, and throughout the 1970s and 80s, these two manufacturers dominated parks around the world as their coasters got larger and more complex. By the late 80s, Aero was top of the industry, and in 1989, revolutionized it by manufacturing Magnum XL200, the world's first hypercoaster for Cedar Point, launching what later became known as the Coaster Wars, where parks competed to have the tallest and fastest record-breaking coasters, which definitively ended in 2005 with the opening of King Ka, a Six Flags Great Adventure. However, with Magnum, it was notable for its lack of inversions, and what made it so significant was that it was the first coaster to reach over 200 feet in height, standing at what used to be an impressive 205 feet on the left hill, to the intimidation of riders at the time. It's interesting how quaint this looks when compared to today, and part of the reason for that is because of a duo of Swiss engineers, Bolliger and Mabillard. In the 80s, they were working for Giovanola, a subcontractor for Intamin that provided ride parts for Intamin's coasters. They engineered what is known as the box beam track design, and you could find this with a few Intamin coasters from the 80s, along with Giovanilla's own brief attempt at creating coasters in the early 2000s with Goliath at Six Flags Magic Mountain and Titan at Six Flags Over Texas. However, Bolliger and Mabillard left to create their own company, which, taking on their name, is now commonly abbreviated to just B&M, and they rocked the industry with their first creation in 1990. Known as Iron Wolf, which was built for Six Flags Great America, what distinguished it was not just its size and intensity, but also its comfortability, as part of what made it notable was that it was a stand-up coaster. It certainly wasn't the first, but B&M quickly showed that they could make the standing trains a lot more comfortable, in conjunction with their more flexible track design, which was engineered with the help of computers and was manufactured with much more precision. If you compare this to Aero, they were still installing the same basic track pieces and bending the rails on site to connect them all together. Iron Wolf was a big hit, and something that no one had ever seen out of coaster design before, and they quickly impressed again with another innovation in 1992. Also premiering at Six Flags Great America, B&M invented their own version of an inverted coaster with Batman the Ride, which not only debuted trains that were so much better than any other inverted coaster other manufacturers had attempted to create, but it was also another intense monster of a layout, one that still holds up incredibly well today. With the increased popularity of coasters across America, Busch Gardens wanted to premiere 2 new coasters in the early 90s. For Busch Gardens Williamsburg, they contracted Aero, which had manufactured Python for Tampa, and went on to create the Loch Ness Monster with its iconic interlocking vertical loops for Williamsburg in 1978. While B&M was new and exciting, Aero was still top of the industry, and so in 1992, they premiered Drachenfire for Williamsburg, which by all accounts was awful. By this point, Aero was scaling up their coasters by making them taller and bigger, but wasn't actually changing much about their track design, leading to incredible intensity and roughness. With Drachenfire, not only was it plagued with technical issues, but it was infamously rough and came with many reports of injuries to riders. It closed in 1998, and I think it's easy to classify this as a disaster, both for Aero and for Busch Gardens Williamsburg. Meanwhile, in Tampa, Busch had contracted B&M, and in 1993, Kumba opened to rave reviews, and the contrast couldn't be more stark. While the Coaster Wars is defined by that constant need to break height and speed records, what was also important for this period was B&M's innovation, whether through making stand-up trains a lot more popular, showing that inverted coasters were viable, and in the case of Kumba, demonstrating that coaster layouts could become massive and complex, while still providing riders with a decent degree of comfortability. Other coaster manufacturers were experimenting with technology in their coaster design too, but in the 90s and through the first decade of the 2000s, B&M rose to the top both through their heavy innovation and the quality of their products. It's also worth noting that Aero did too little too late to keep up with the rest of the industry, and by 2001 declared bankruptcy. I think that's why Kumba is so significant, in that it set a standard for coaster design, proving to parks around the world that traditional sit-down coasters could get a lot more intense and complex while keeping riders safe from injury. And so, while it's maybe not as flashy as the first stand-up or inverted coaster, Kumba definitely became a milestone in the development of coaster history. If you walked up to Kumba while it was operating, you would often hear it before you actually saw it. It had a distinct roar as the train cycled through the track, and Busch Gardens really played into this, marketing the word Kumba as meaning to roar from an African language. As to what language that was, Busch Gardens never told anybody, and I recall watching an Expedition theme park video from a while back where he debunked the myth that this actually meant anything. It was essentially just a piece of marketing from a time when people wouldn't know any better, but I still really like this idea of a vaguely mythical African animal from the Congo, one that's power was projected through this impressive roller coaster. On boarding the ride, it made a right turn out of the station and ascended up the lift hill, which is encircled by a vertical loop. There's no scenario where you could have been going up the lift hill as another train went through it, but it still made for an impressive visual. On cresting the top, the track banks down and to the left as the train drops 135 feet, immediately sending you into that massive vertical loop that stood 114 feet tall. Coming out, the train is sent left into a dive loop, dipping into a small valley, and immediately follows up with a 0G roll, where riders feel the sensation of weightlessness. Before anyone has time to orient themselves, the train travels to a bridge where it enters a cobra roll, which, viewing it from the bridge itself as it wrapped around the walkway, was truly impressive. Exiting this element and facing back to the station, the train cuts into a brake run and slows down for the interlocking corkscrews. I think that was definitely the signature moment for Kumba, especially with how iconic the visual kineticism became as an icon of Florida tourism, but from what I recall, these two elements were also the smoothest inversions of the ride. Despite their intensity, this moment allowed riders to find a familiar landmark as they knew it was close to the station, and continuing through the course, the train dives into a tunnel themed to look like a cave. Quickly exiting, riders turn right and are pinned down by strong positive Gs as they move upward through a helix, and as quickly as the experience started, riders find themselves in the final series of brake runs before returning to the station. While not as refined as later B&M coasters, part of what made Kumba so unique was how its collection of elements played with the landscape. Unlike most other parks, where they just place coasters where they have the space, and you can't really watch them, Busch Gardens has always stood out through how they frame their coasters along the pathways. Walking over that bridge to the Congo, as Kumba roared above, and as riders were screaming, did build a lot of excitement. In my opinion, a well-designed coaster isn't just comfortable and well-paced, but also works like a kinetic sculpture, projecting power through its impressive speed, and inspiring a bit of awe from the ground. Kumba certainly did this, and was impressive because of it. And yet, in terms of ride experience, it was also rough and unrefined, in a way that became apparent as B&M continued to get better and better. When I visited Six Flags America last year to see what it was like before it closed, one of the coasters I was most excited to ride was Firebird. This was actually the original Iron Wolf, which closed at the end of Six Flags Great America's operating season in 2011. It was then shipped to this park, reopening in 2012 as Apocalypse, and then in 2019 replaced the standing trains with sit-down ones, being rethemed yet again as Firebird. This was a piece of history I was excited to ride, and yet because it was the first B&M, I found it to be unexpectedly rough with awkward transitions that whipped the train painfully, and in retrospect, Kumba suffered from the same issue as well. That's not to say that it was nearly as bad, because it wasn't. But if, for example, you watch closely as the train comes out of the first drop and into the vertical loop, you can see how abruptly the track corrects to straighten itself out, which led you to bopping your ears on the over-the-shoulder restraint. Another example where this occurs is on the Cobra roll, which was tighter and whippier than subsequent coasters. And the point I'm making is that while Kumba had a lot of positives, the actual ride experience itself wasn't the greatest. It's still a lot better than Iron Wolf, but you could still detect a lot of unrefined design in there, and so that leads me to my next point. No matter how iconic Kumba was, its age was definitely showing, and I think it was time to go. So, if Kumba is so iconic to Busch Gardens, why not have it completely retract? I've seen people making the comparison to the Incredible Hulk, which closed in 2015, but reopened the following year with all-new track. Obviously, this makes a lot of sense for Universal, as it's one of their most popular attractions and one of the best attended parks in the world, but what's also important to consider is that they were likely contractually obligated to keep it and couldn't replace it with something else, as Disney has owned Marvel Comics since 2009. I'm sure that Disney would love for Universal to give up the rights to Marvel so that they could build another awful version of Avengers Campus. But since Universal isn't likely able to do anything other than making minor upgrades and changes in the land, like they did with updating the quality of the media for The Amazing Adventures of Spider-Man, it makes sense that the Incredible Hulk would be rebuilt, considering that it reached the end of its shelf life and they really had no other option. With Kumba though, I guess Busch Gardens could certainly order a track replacement, but why would they want to? It's still great, but has been outclassed by pretty much everything else that the park has introduced since. and in the last 10 years, I can't remember ever waiting more than 5 minutes for it, even while often running a single train. It may be iconic as an important part of both Floridian and coaster history, but it simply does not make sense to completely retrack a ride that feels outdated by today's coaster standards and has not aged as gracefully as other B&Ms in the park. I do miss the era when B&M was producing these really aggressive sit-down coasters though, and Kumba's loss will be felt by the people who could appreciate it most. What's interesting is that Busch Gardens has already announced a replacement, Kumba's Revenge, and people have speculated wildly on what this could be, with a lot of people convinced that it will be a giga coaster along the lines of Fury. But you know what I think would be really bold? B&M and Busch Gardens' parent company, United Parks, appear to be working together to debut a number of experimental models for B&M, including SeaWorld Orlando's Pipeline and Penguin Trek, along with Busch Gardens Tampa's Phoenix Rising. Traditional B&M loopers seem to have gone out of style a long time ago, and maybe Kumba's Revenge could bring it back, but with a massive lift hill over 300 feet tall and launches throughout the track. I think whatever Kumba's Revenge will be, it should try to replicate elements like the Cobra roll over the bridge, and most importantly, the interlocking corkscrews. And by trying to reinvent their traditional looper, but making it even larger and more intense, it could generate a lot of interest in the park instead of building another non-inverting giga coaster, even as cool as that would be. Kumba, while flawed, was great and iconic, and I thought it would be fun to throw together a shorter video to understand its historical importance and legacy, even if its closure does make a lot of sense. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, I would very much appreciate it if you left a like if you haven't yet done so. As always though, if you haven't yet subscribed and hit the bell notification yet either, you can also do so now to be alerted to new videos as they're released.